Good evening and welcome to this, our third episode of the South African Equestrian Federation's podcast from the horse's mouth. My name is Georgie Roberts and I guess tonight that makes me your horse. We are speaking tonight about a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, not only as a coach and a rider, but also as a parent. From Athlete A to Lance Armstrong, we have seen bullying, sexual harassment, assault and intimidation prevalent throughout all sports throughout the world, and equestrian sport is certainly no exception. The United States Equestrian Federation has brought out in the last few years their Safe Sport initiative, which has had a very mixed reception. But as The Guardian, which is the anonymous reporting platform we are speaking to tonight, as they so rightfully say, this is really about preserving the integrity of not only the sport, but of our athletes. So tonight, I'm very pleased to be speaking to Mark Hardwick, the Managing Director of The Guardian. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Georgie.
Great to have you here. So, Mark, I think we obviously haven't spoken before. I think it would be great to just begin a little bit by discussing what defines perhaps safeguarding and its purpose in sport. And I see you guys also look after schools and businesses as well.
Yeah, we do. So I think it's important to kind of get it down what safeguarding is, and then I think, like you rightly said, we're sitting on the back of Athlete A and various other things. There was my only story from last year, and there's just like so many things. And all of a sudden, there's a focus, and where does that come from? So I think, and answering the question first, what is safeguarding? One of the challenges that we often see in terms of the definition is the idea that safety and safeguarding are really the same thing, and the reality is that they're not. They're both very important. They are both skills that I believe every single tournament, every single training event needs to be cognizant of. But the reality is that they're different. So firstly, and I can't talk enough into equestrian because I'm not enough of an expert, but what I will say is that every single sport will have rules and doesn't get injured whilst training or competing in that sport. So certain sports, like for example gymnastics, would have padding that would need to be put around the equipment. When one looks at a sport, for example, like rugby, there's very stringent rules, and the referee or technical official has the right to remove the person. Canoeing, we have to have a helmet and a life jacket. I'm assuming, and in most of the on horse sports, you would need to be wearing a helmet, and those kind of really talk into ensuring that the sport is safe. Safeguarding, on the other hand, is as a result of the fact that for me to engage in your sport, or for me to engage in your school, in your environment, in your business, doesn't matter, what has to happen is human beings need to communicate with each other. There's the possibility of toxic relationships developing, and because those toxic relationships can develop, organizations need to put safeguarding structures in place. Now, those toxic relationships could be anything from bullying, sexual harassment, sexual assaults, inappropriate relationships, etc. Kind of way safeguarding finds its space. Is everything okay?
Yes, that's fine. Sorry.
Okay, good. Okay, so yeah, I suppose to answer your question, what is safeguarding? I think that's it. It's not safety. It's safeguarding. It's making sure that people are protected from other people.
Yeah, I think also the potential for abuse in a sporting system, I suppose, schools and businesses are the same, where there's a very clear hierarchy of power. Wherever there's power, there's obviously the potential for abuse of that power.
Absolutely. And it is something that, is getting the focus. It is getting a lot of focus at the moment, and rightly so. I think that for far too long, there's been a time where behavior has kind of been, I think, brushes a very real time in quite recent human history, where there were people that were essentially defined as untouchables, and people that were able to do things that were unacceptable, and because of their fame, because of their money, because of various other political connections, they became untouchables. And I think that barrier is kind of breaking down. It's not probably breaking down quick enough, but it certainly is breaking down. We're certainly seeing from most governments around the world a less tolerance of this thing. Certainly in your first world countries. I'm not saying that there is a tolerance level in South Africa by any stretch of the imagination, but all I'm saying is that this is a relatively new concept. And so there are places where we're still getting it wrong. But I think that we are significantly further down the road than we were.
Mark, so I think the next step, and I know this sounds like quite an obvious one, but I think, could you help us speak towards what is the definition of harassment, bullying, sexual impropriety? I do think that sometimes it goes under the mask of a joke. And I really liked one of the pushes that we did for this podcast, where it said it's never a joke. It's never funny. Certain things aren't funny. And I think a lot of the time, the more vulnerable parties are often told that, they can't take a joke. They're being too serious. And I think that also really blurs the line, especially for a lot of younger, more vulnerable parties, to voice these concerns or ask the correct questions.
Yeah, so I think that for me, using the idea that it's a joke is a defense. And to me, if what you're doing needs defending, then I think we need to be questioning the integrity of what you're doing right out of the starting gate. For me, very often when you turn it around, because those defenses, and certainly with regard to some of the things you're talking about, like sexual harassment and those kinds of things, very often one finds that, obviously being male over female, that's not to say it always happens in that direction, but I think,
Sure.
You tend to see men kind of being more for them, kind of pushing the boundaries further, even after women have made. And then when she kind of goes, okay, I've had enough, he goes, oh, but I was only joking. And I think the litmus is to go, okay, you were only joking. If this was your daughter, is it okay that for me to make this joke that your daughter's bum is really sexy, or her boobs look really, really good in that top, and for me to consistently say that, even after she's told me she doesn't like it, would it be okay for me to continue doing that to your daughter? No, but hold on, I'm only joking. Well, it doesn't matter, because you can't put my daughter out like that. Well, then what gives you the right then to put another woman out like that, or to put a child out like that, or to create a place where you, through whatever power you believe you have the right to make anybody, and yes, sexual harassment rises in that space, but it's not just sexual harassment. It's also bullying. It's also inappropriate coaching mechanisms. There's so many places where the abuse finds itself under the line that's easy to see. And what I mean by easy to see is sexual assault is easy to define. We can go, this is what happened, this is the medical evidence, we can see it. Physical assault similarly. But one thing we've got to be very, very cognizant of is that the scars pertaining to sexual abuse and the scars pertaining to physical abuse, which we tend to give it a lot more credence to, heal significantly quicker than the scars from emotional abuse. Significantly quicker. And interesting, both the physical and the sexual abuse, the scars that do stick around as a result of that abuse are the ones that came as a result of the emotional abuse. It's the fact that she or he needs to think about what the hell you did, what you said, what you put them through. And that can that can change the trajectory of someone's life. And we've got to have a zero tolerance for it.
Absolutely. I'm really grateful that you speak about that, Mark, because it's a massive thing, the mental health elements of things. And I think, and as you say, we're not saying that there's a tolerance for it, but, you know, the labeling also of snowflakes, you know, and people who can't take a joke, and the people who struggle with mental health. You know, that's even speaking about, you know, war veterans with PTSD and, oh, they don't make them like they used to. I do think that we're hopefully improving our attitude towards mental health. I think it's easier, or it's perhaps more monitored in the workplace nowadays. With regards to sports, how are you seeing structures like national federations putting forward plans to protect athletes from these more vague bullying elements, as well as the more dangerous, you know, the elements of actual physical assault?
Yeah, so it's new. We can kind of go, you know, I'm nearly 50. I went to school very different. So things have changed, and one can argue, yeah, Mark, but our day we were a bit more resilient. We were a little tougher.
Yeah, but were we really?
Well, I think we were. I think to be. Why did I need to have a thick skin to defend myself against people who couldn't shut their trap and just keep their opinion to themselves? Why did I have to be tougher? I get that we were. Yeah, times were tougher, and people just were a little bit more, oh, the kid's not going to grow up to be tough. The kid's not going to, okay. So if we have someone who cannot, who doesn't like being told they're fat and ugly and stupid and da da da, if we have a person that doesn't like that health issue, or is the person that's picking on them the one with the challenge? Which is the one should we be looking after? Or should we be justifying the unacceptable behavior? Or do we have to like take time now to protect the victim? No, the guy's got to stop it. This unacceptable behavior has got to remain the unacceptable behavior.
And how are sporting structures looking towards creating this safer space? I mean, obviously an app like Guardian, which is an anonymous reporting platform that all the athletes will be able to download. Obviously that's part of it. What are other measures that you think the national federations and the athletes themselves need to be putting into place to protect one another?
So I think the first thing, you know, when federations decide how they're going to move down this road, I think that unquestionably step one is a policy manual. So they need to ensure that they have safeguarding policy. This is the rules of engagement. As a federation, if you're going to engage with our federation at any level, whether you are training, whether you are competing, whether you're going overseas, whether you're competing locally with our federation, then you need to adhere to these rules. And federations have got to be guarded against writing policy that they don't police, because that then becomes even more dangerous than if they didn't have the policy in the first place. So the policy must be in place. And you're talking into reporting, but reporting is the reactive side. And for me, it is like if I could wave a wand and be to not remove the questions like how do we handle reporting, but to realize the question of how do we prevent reporting needed to happen in the
That's great.
first place. This thing is, and for me, I think this is a very valuable piece of information, and almost it seems like academic, and it seems kind of, you know, almost this trivia type of information. but it's so relevant. We have arguably one of the best constitutions in the world, without a question. We have some of the best reactive legislation in the world. We really, really do when it comes to safeguarding of children. If you rape a child in South Africa, we have legislation. When it comes to the proactive stuff, we're in the bush. We don't have any proactive legislation. Now, the problem that has happened now, or when I say the problem, what has happened is the likes of independent UNESCO and the confederations, the international confederations, who are primarily sitting in countries that, as a result of being more first world, have stronger proactive legislation. These proactive standards, SASCOC, you're not going to be able to send your South African team to compete on our Olympic stage or our international stage. Now the South Africans are going, well, hold the phone. Let us adhere to, we're filling the gap of, we're filling the failure of proactive legislation with policy. So what the federations are doing and what the federations are saying is, listen, guys, South Africans, we're competitive. We know what's going to happen is if you want to compete, put your proactive stuff in place. We don't have law to say it. Doesn't matter. Because if we want to go and compete over there in Birmingham at the Commonwealth, or we want to go to Tokyo to the Olympics, SASCOC are driving the policy. The policies are proactive. Now we're causing the federations to behave in a way that mitigates as far as possible these things from happening. The next thing is to kind of go, once the policy is in place, and stick it on the top shelf of some secretary's office, we need to get people, designated safeguarding officers. They need to be appointed and trained at every single club of every single and the policy for their federation, and make sure it's being adhered to. So not just the policy pertaining to reporting, but the change room policy. Is there a change room policy? Does the change room policy, for example, talk to something referred to as the rule of two? The rule of two says that the change room, if there are children in that change room, if there are kids in there, you take an adult with you. And that rule of two applies to the online world as well. But we have that policy, and when that policy is transgressed, the designated safeguarding officer steps in and says, hey, Mark, or hey, your own, or don't go into the change room with your cell phone, or whatever, you know. So these policies are in place. We've now got the people policing them. And then we get to your question. A long way of getting there. But the reporting, a lot of the federations have been a bit concerned about reports coming in because they don't have internal skill sets to address the reports when they come in. So it's kind of one of those, let us make a problem because we're not quite sure how we're going to deal with it. They're facing that now. Their policy is giving them the tools to deal with it. In partnering with us, certainly with SAF, but most of the federations are partnering with us. They have that skill set as an outsourced service provider. So, or there is a relationship that's inappropriate, they just pick up the phone and they go, how's it, Mark? Listen, or one of our guys, and we'll just jump in and take over and sort that out. So the reactive side we've got, but if we focus on the proactive side, preventing them from offending in the first place, that's gold.
So I think one of the things that SAEF is looking to bring in is that all registered coaches will have to do a safeguarding course. And that, of
Yep.
course, is part of this. And then you've also spoken about policy and how essential policy is. And I would just like everyone who's listening to see that in the description of the podcast, at the bottom, there is a link to the South African Equestrian Federation's policies and regulations tab on the website, and the safeguarding policy is under there. And Mark, I actually know Janine Turner, who was one of our guests last week. She sits on the SAEF Judicial Council, and they made our safeguarding policy as a combination of the the International Equestrian Federation's safeguarding policy, as well as SASCOC's. SASCOC, of course, being the South African Sporting Commission and Olympic Committee. And they have quite a comprehensive, as you say, we have an excellent constitution. We really are about protecting the vulnerable. So SASCOC's constitution, safeguarding policy, I believe was about 17 pages long, whereas the FEI's was only about 3. So the SAEF safeguarding policy documents is actually quite a comprehensive one. And those documents are, of course, available for everyone to read and to provide some feedback. But Mark, you did speak about safeguarding officers. Can we discuss a little bit, what is a safeguarding officer? Who are they? What is the role that's, you've said, obviously, their role is to be the intermediary between the victim and the National Federation.
So the designated safeguarding officer, or DSO. So, so very quickly, called the Kazan Action Plan, and I'm not that right now. 116 countries signed into it. South Africa was a signatory. The 3 takeaways from the Kazan Action Plan is every sporting federation must have a policy. And then this training. The training is the 3rd leg. Now, the training needs to be done on 2 levels. The first is an SAC, or Safeguarding Awareness Certificate. It is literally just the basics of safeguarding, just so you can understand what, and every single coach, every mentor, every physio, every doctor, every person engaged in the federation must do this SAC. It is a 2-hour course. It's got a little multiple choice at the end, and then it's done and dusted, and you don't have to look at it again for a year. And that is your SAC. Your DS, so designated safeguarding officer. If I can try and explain it in more layman terms, like, for example, the Road Traffic Act, your policy would be the Road Traffic Act. The SAC would be the driver's license that everyone's got to have. And the DSO would kind of be the policeman, the person that's responsible for policing that legislation or policing that policy in this environment. So that designated safeguarding officer at each of the clubs, they are going to go through, I'm not quite sure if you guys are doing it over a 2-day course or if it's over a 3-evening course. We do offer both, but I know that you are going to be doing that. And those DSOs, when appointing the DSO for your club, I always say the most important thing is to make sure that the person you choose is not conflict adverse. The person needs to be able to call people out if they're doing something incorrect. Their responsibility is, number 1, to safeguard the athletes, coaches, spectators, and anybody engaging with that club. Number 2, to make sure that the club itself is not at risk from reputation, etc. And then finally, to ensure the federation is safe from things like reputational damage, etc., etc., etc. So they really are the go-between of the federation and the athletes. They are where the tacky hits the tar. They are the people that go. It's all, like I said, it's all because they're ensuring, or at least the policy. If there's no one in there ensuring the policy being adhered to, we might as well have the policy in the first place. And so that's the role of the designated safeguarding officer.
And Mark, who can be a safeguarding officer?
So literally anybody.
Okay.
Like I say, it can be. It must be someone who's not conflict adverse. And In my experience, I tend to find that people that are a little more mature, part of the club for 30, 40 years, some 25-year-old telling them that they can't do this and can't do that doesn't really go down that well. So tend to have somebody that is a little older does work better. That's not to say that, you can't have a 25-year-old and they can't do the job.
Should it be a counselor or someone with that kind of...
Just rule of necessary.
Should it be a...
So your brain's jumping into the reactive. The reactive isn't something that we need to... It's a proactive role. It's an administrative role, or if you've got somebody who's a policeman at your club, or all of these kinds of things may have added value, but they're certainly not a prerequisite. Like if you're sitting with a club that doesn't have that skill set in one of their members, it's not a case of going, well, now we can't have it. It has to be the proactive.
Mark, we've got a couple of questions in the comments thread. So one of the questions is, how does anyone who is a victim of sexual harassment prove this if there's no physical or visual proof?
How do they prove it? Is that the question?
Yes.
So firstly, they need to report it. So I would report, as an example, last Saturday night or whatever, Georgie said something that I felt, and nobody else that's there, it's just Georgie and me. Well, then you do end up in a he said, she said situation, and that can be a little challenging to prove. And so sometimes it can't be done, but it will do whatever they want. Certainly in a sexual harassment space, it's probably doing and saying that with other people. And so the DSO can then kind of run an investigation and go, well, let me find out how much merit there is to this allegation. One must bear in mind that when we're talking about sexual harassment, which isn't criminal, it's civil, we would ultimately, if we were going to go down that road, go to a disciplinary inquiry, and the end game would be to terminate that person's membership at the club. They wouldn't be able to be a part of the club. They wouldn't be able to be a part of the competitions. They couldn't be a technical official, etc., etc. So we would expel them from the federation. Now,
what is the process? Sorry, Mark, if I can interrupt you there. What is the process from when you report this to your safeguarding officer? And this is just a little side note to say that the South African Equestrian Federation is looking for safeguarding officer volunteers in all provinces, male and female. But once you've reported it to the safeguarding officer, what is the chain of, just very briefly, what is the chain of command to how that gets escalated? And does it necessarily result in it going to the SAPS, for example?
Okay, so harassment is so big. So as an example, I could say to you, Georgie, as an example, I could say, Georgie, I think you've got very pretty eyes. You may take offense to that. And
I would never take offense to that, Mark. Flattery will get you. I'm joking. Wrong podcast.
Well, Mark is sick. But the reality is you may or may not. So it's very difficult to kind of go, when this is said, it is sexual harassment, because the sexual harassment lies with the person who's receiving it. So that's one level of sexual harassment. Behind you, and I put my hand under your top and I grabbed your boobs. Well, that's also sexual harassment. One could even push that as far as possibly sexual assault. Now, the truth of it is, if your question is, how do we deal with sexual harassment? Well, both of them. That is why trying to find the skill set in-house to deal with the reactive side is extremely difficult, and having somebody like the Guardian to assist. My suggestion would be to the DSO is to say to them,
your credit card details.
What do you know about this case? Sorry, you made me lose my train of thought.
It's fine. Can we pick up from there? Sorry, guys, we are having some technical difficulties with Zoom, as you will be seeing on the screen. But to move on from that, one of the next questions, Mark, which I think is a very valid thing, is should someone report abuse, what procedures are in place to protect them from their abusers and from facing a backlash after making a report? Because I think that is the fear of a lot of people, is that it's not worth it. And yes, the person might get evicted from the club, but where we do tend to have a little bit of this idolatry around our riding idols, you often find that you're not necessarily just incurring the wrath of the person who was the abuser or the assaulter, but from their, I don't want to say their fan club, but from their supporters, their pupils, their patrons, their sponsors. How do we offer to protect victims from that? I mean, that's a really tricky thing, and one only needs to look at what happened with the woman who reported Harvey Weinstein, for example, and how they were pulled through the ringer to realize what an ominous threat this is for so many.
So the reality is that SAF are using our anonymous reporting app, so you can, number one, make the report anonymously. There is a provision in law that says that if somebody does their evidence and their statement and their witnesses to prove your side of the story. However, there are provisions that we can make if you came to me as Georgie and said, listen, Mark, this has happened, we would make provisions within we would make provisions within the disciplinary code, so not the policy manual, but within the disciplinary code, that would allow for you to give evidence through, no one gets to see you. You can give evidence. You give evidence through another person. There's a lot of ways for us to deal with this. One must bear in mind that South Africa has a Protected Disclosures Act. There is literally legislation that wants to disclose anonymously. We couldn't, unfortunately, kind of completely go down the road of criminal prosecution, but we certainly could address many of the civil things. Using that as its own merits, its own curveballs, and really does need a specialist looking into it.
That's great. Mark, there's another two questions here. It's a two-part question. The first is there a period in which a complaint has to be lodged? I know, because I love watching a nice CSI to relax at night, I know that they talk about the statute of limitations often. Does that exist? And then B, how does the federation process interface with criminal or civil claims related to the same incident, which we briefly touched on where I asked you about like the SAPS, but I think you've outlined the difference between a civil and a criminal case as well. Sorry,
so I lost you there on the second question. The first question is how long have you got to report? Yes. What was the second one, sorry?
The second one is how does the federation basically integrate with criminal or civil claims related to the same incident? But I think I can even say there that the federation is obviously not a judicial body, so but please help us out.
But there is a little caveat there. So in terms of the amount of tunnels, some cases or some crimes do have a statute of limitations. So it depending on what we're talking about. Rape, for example, murder, that you can report that forever and eternity. That doesn't expire. Space. So in the civil space, if you came forward and go, okay, listen, I want to report this and this and this, my question to you is going to be, okay, cool, why did you take so long? And if you've got a pretty good reason as to why you took long, then we must go forward and we must move ahead with this thing. Again, every case on its own merits. There is no statute of limitations. If you want to come and talk to me about something that happened in 1982, Come and talk to me about it. Let's listen to what it is. Let's have a look at the merits, and then we'll guide you. We'll kind of, and at least at that stage, you know your options. If you're wanting to know about something that happened there, that's current. We're dealing with cases that some of them are going back to the 80s and 90s. So yeah, I think that might help assist answering that question. Then in terms of civil versus criminal, so there is within that space, like I mentioned just now, something called the burden of proof. The burden of proof in a criminal matter is Latin terminology called prima facie evidence. Prima facie evidence means beyond all reasonable doubt. So if you want to charge me criminally with something, your evidence needs to be beyond all reasonable doubt. With that said, in the civil space, that burden is significantly lower. That burden is balance of probabilities, which is who out of you and me is probably telling the truth. And the ruling of the chairperson will decide who is probably telling the truth. Now, what I'm saying is I would have been able to explain the challenge for me that I see, and the caveat that I think people need to be aware of, is to go if hold on a second, okay, so I'm going to use a quite extreme example here. So let's assume the allegation is rape. Let's assume the allegation is rape of a child, rape of a 5-year-old child. That's the allegation. Now what happens is the federations in the past, their go-to will be, listen, Mark is the suspect, Mark has been arrested. Pending the outcome of the criminal prosecution, we will then decide how we're going to handle Mark in terms of evidence or whatever the case may be. The problem with that, and when you link your disciplinary code to the criminal matter, the problem with that is that you're then saying that my ability to coach in your is dependent on whether or not the SAPS can get prima facie evidence and a 5-year-old can stand up to cross-examination from a defense attorney.
No, that seems horrifying.
We need to kind of go that a DSO, 100%, but we need to go the DSO, the federal, in jail. You don't have to do that. It's the police's job. You may want the guy to go to jail because of what he did to the 5-year-old, but you and every other normal South African wants that to go to jail. Your job is eyes on the prize. Stay in your lane. It is your job to protect. That is it. So when that allegation is made, run your disciplinary inquiry. If the police put him in jail, if they don't, if they fluff the case, if they're corrupt, if they're useless, it doesn't matter. Once we've expelled him from the club, we've met our obligation. We've made the athletes safe, we made the coaches safe, we made the club safe, we made the federation safe. That is our only goal. You want the guy to go to jail, and speaking to women, speaking to my wife's friends, that rape children is significantly worse than them going to jail. So I understand the rest of that, but that's not the job of the DSO. The job of the DSO is beginning and end safeguarding of athletes, coaches, club.
And we're erring on the side of caution here, which I think is really lovely and essential. It's essential to operate, I think, in protecting the most vulnerable amongst us. I also would like to just raise this, Mark, is I was very interested to hear by a psychologist who I spoke to who does work with compromised children. It's Sharon Boyce from Shumbashaba, an equestrian center. And she said that a really important thing for coaches to understand is they would fall under the same set of legislation as schools, which is that it falls under the if you hear something or if you see something, say something rule, that if you suspect something or if you have heard a rumor, it's not up to you to decide whether or not it's true or false or to escalate it. You're legally obligated to do so. Is that correct?
So yeah, that's it's partially correct. It's not an obligation that teachers need to meet. It's an obligation that every single South African has to meet. It's just the law of the country. And that law finds its face in three pieces of legislation: the Sexual Offences Act, the Children's Act, and the Domestic Violence Act. If you are aware of a child who has been sexually assaulted, so they've made an allegation, you have to report it to the SAPS. Failing to do so is punishable by 5 years imprisonment. The Children's Act says that if you are aware of a child at risk and you fail to report it, again, 5 years imprisonment. And if you are aware of a child going home to a pass-on mass scenario or any level of domestic violence and you don't report it, again, 5 years imprisonment. So all three of those legislations, and that's got nothing to do with teachers. That's kind of like the Road Traffic Act. We've all got to drive at 60. This is just, if you're in South Africa, that's the law. If you're aware of it, you've got to report it, done and dusted. There is no kind of applies to specific people.
So, Mark, for example, if I'm at a show and I overhear something happening to another competitor, could I, once the Guardian app is obviously up and running for SAEF, could I go onto that to anonymously report on behalf of the other party?
Not even could. You should.
Okay, great.
100%.
There was another question here. No, there was not. I would just like to point out that we have had a very generous offer of sponsorship, I suppose, from Lara Elwood from Farnham Riding School and Equestrian Centre. Lara, this is actually a really wonderful gesture, and I would like to thank you. It makes me a bit choked up. Lara would like to offer 10 free counselling sessions to anybody listening who might need a session. And we'll speak now, Mark, about the role that this plays in recovery, I think. But Lara has given me permission to share her cell phone number here. If you would like a counselling session, please reach out to Lara at 076 149 5830. There is another question, Mark, and we can come back to counselling. The first is, how do we ensure that registered sexual offenders do not become coaches? And again, I was a little bit interested to see, as far as I could see from what I was looking up online, there isn't necessarily a sexual offenders registry that's easily accessible by the public in South Africa. So like in the States, I know that it's pretty easy to find, or is there?
Oh, okay. So it's not like in the States. Unfortunately, and I may upset people when I say this, but the reality is I don't know that South Africa has the collective EQ strong enough for us to just point out where people that have sexually abused and finding heads floating down the river.
Well, Mark, your wife might be one of the first people who goes visiting that offenders list and meets out some street justice. I'm with her.
Sure. So, and South Africa also has a child protection register. There are different registers, offenders register. It could be on the sex offenders register, not on the child protection register, and it could be on any one of those registers, and you don't have a criminal record. So it's not okay to kind of check one and not check the others. The legislation that who is in your employer. So when we look at the definitions in that legislation, an employee is someone who is remunerated and someone who isn't remunerated. So volunteers, in terms of that legislation, would be termed, excuse me, I would then be defined as an employee, because I have to use the club where the club is. I've got to use the club during the opening and closing times. There is management control over the legislation. Because that relationship exists, the employer has to, not nice to have, has to check the employee against the sex offenders register. failing to check against the sex offenders register is punishment for the employer of potentially 7 years imprisonment, and the failing to check against the child protection register is potentially 10 years. Stable person, every single person that's selling coffee at the competition or at the club or whatever, they've got to be cleared. They have to be cleared. And not only is that a statute which we spoke about just now.
Mark, so is this an incentive then? Because we do have our coaches' registration system is not a complete one in South African equestrian sport. And that's because we have, I don't want to offend any disciplines by leaving one out, but I think we have 17 disciplines within the SAEF. So obviously we've got a lot of different coaches. They're not all under one central database. The SAEF is looking to do this. And obviously then for the parents who are currently hiring a coach who coaches at the back of a small town and they're the only coach in the area and they're freelancing, they're not necessarily working under a riding school or under a club, even, it happens. The incentive is then is the incentive for the parents now to go onto the SAEF's website when the coaches are listed and to choose one of those coaches, because then they are then under the umbrella of comfort that their coach is a safe coach.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when we look at what we refer to as individual sports, the challenges are little more difficult to where a one-on-one coaching session is happening is quite difficult. So to give you an example with some of the other federations, fencing, for example, there could be a coach who's coaching in his garage, or golf, there could be somebody and he's a coach. So yes, exactly what you're saying is how it has to play when you've got individual sports. So the federation needs to have a coaching policy. The coaching policy needs to always be displayed something along the lines of, any person looking for a coach, it is, especially a parent, it is your responsibility to ensure that the coach you are using is recognized, to check this or whatever. And yes, it would take you to the website of the federation, and they 100% should be listed there, because it's, when we look at the risk, so we talk about these risks to the federation. There are, for example, your sport, this equestrian sport, is just so far removed from any space in my reality. So
it's far removed from the reality of most normal people.
Me or anybody in my family engages with. All of a sudden, one of my two boys decides that they want to start riding horses. So off I go, and I know here, for example, I've seen horses running around here by Kings Park. Yeah, that's the only place I would go. And I think so. I would take a drive down there and I'd say, listen, my oaks want to learn about horses. They checked it on TV. They think it's KIF. Can we give it a whirl? I know nothing about it. It is reasonable for me to believe that and that my children are not at risk. That is a reasonable expectation for me. Now, 2 months down the line, one of these oaks sexually assaults one of my children. I have a civil claim, because if he had a previous conviction and was never checked, you're going to go, oh, hold on a second, we didn't even know he was coaching your kids. He's down there in nowhere coaching your kids. How the hell were we supposed to know that? Absolutely. Well, were my kids able to responsibility to know who that damn coach was. You had a responsibility to make sure my kids were safe. And just like athlete A, the federation is going to have a civil claim of note coming their way. So yes, it is something that we need to be transparent. Previous conviction, rather hang up your boots or your bridle or your stirrups or shit. I don't know what
I'm so impressed, but Mark. That's quite a lot of horse terminology there. Well done.
Yeah.
Mark, there's another question here, and I think this
I've watched a couple of West.
Don't lie, Mark. I know you've read Jilly Cooper. I can see here there's another question from someone, and I think this is a really great question. At what point does someone stand up to their bully? You know, at what point, and this is a really interesting, because it is that line that you were speaking about earlier on. Where is it a joke that's just gone one step too far? And I have a 5-year-old at home who makes terrible jokes at my expense, and I've tried to explain to her that it's only a joke if 2 people are laughing. But I think it's that really tricky gray area of where do you call somebody out? And obviously, unfortunately, the first place to call people out, I would imagine, is in person and in the moment, which is really hard with the power structures I think that we have.
So when we do training at schools and when we do training at various institutions around bullying, and we run some very effective bullying programs in a lot of the schools around the country. And one of the things that we found to be very, very effective is the understanding that within the bullying space, there's almost a triad. There's almost 3 people. There's the bully, the bullied, and the onlooker. And your most powerful weapon in that space happening, because very often they feel uncomfortable about what is happening, because most people don't like to see other people being hurt. And so one of the things that we use, and it's on a lot of our marketing stuff, is a very well-known saying from position. And interestingly, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela all said derivatives of this. And basically it goes, the only thing necessary for the success of evil is for good men to do nothing. Now, in that bullying space, if we can create a culture or an environment in our club, in our social networking groups, where that kind of behavior is not tolerated. And it's not that it's not tolerated by the person that's being bullied. It's not tolerated by anybody who's looking in. I'm going to say, not when you say it to me, because then I'm defending, but I'm going to say, Georgie, what the hell? Why are you saying that against Quis or flippin' Sianda or whoever it is? Why are you saying that? I know that person. They're actually quite nice. And so now use away, the whole culture changes. And once we've got that under wraps, bullying by default goes away.
I really like the idea that there's going to be much stricter ramifications and repercussions. And I think that's a great space to shut down a lot of this bad behavior. You know, if somebody stands the chance of actually being suspended instead of just, told off, you are just going to find people erring on the side of caution. And I do love what you say about, all it takes for bad to thrive is for good people to stay silent. And there's a great movie that's coming out now. I think it's called She Said, or She Spoke, and it's about the Harvey Weinstein case. And one of the women who spoke out only came forward, Mark, at the end, where she said, I've had a daughter, and I don't want her to go through this. I want to create a safe space for her. And I really would like that to maybe be the case, that if you feel someone's been inappropriate with you, but you were perhaps strong enough to speak out against it or put an end to it or kick them in the face, hopefully, to remember that there are other people around you who aren't like that. And if they've done it once, if they've been a bully once, if they've intimidated or harassed someone once, they've likely done it again. So I think speaking out and raising it is a really great space, in that you need to look at it as though you're protecting others, which is hopefully this whole healthy, holistic ecosystem that we're creating here.
Absolutely. So we've got to get to a point in our EQ where talking about this is okay. Talking about this is not the problem, because it's when it stays in the shadows, talking about it, we need to be saying, hey, Mark, don't talk to people like that. What do you mean? No, well, you hurt those people. Don't talk to people like that. That is not okay. Stop being rude. Okay, well, I'll stop. We need to be, we need to realize behind closed doors. The victim is not the person that should be embarrassed. The victim is the person that is the one that needs the power. That we've got to give them the power, because until we give them the power, we leave the power in the hands of the wrong person. It's the reality. So there is power in speaking out, and what you tend to find is that once the person realizes the power in speaking out, it then becomes significantly more difficult. And unfortunately, it's one of those things where it's a university of life thing. Once you've experienced it, you then know it, but you don't know it until you've experienced it. It's not something you can talk. Someone's got to see it, kind of go, okay. I can call you out, and now you're going to stop.
I actually really like that. I've got a friend who says she was speaking to us about something, and she said they said something mean and it just wasn't kind. And I thought that was such a lovely thing for an adult to say. And my 5-year-old has adopted it, and it's really humbling to have your 5-year-old, like we joke, we're quite irreverent in my house, and we were joking about something, and my 5-year-old turned around and she said, "Oh, mommy, that's not kind." And it's awful. And as you say, it really turns the tables if we can create that kind of dialogue. And I really wish that she's got a good 30 years on me. I think that was a really great skill to see. Mark, with the Guardian app, so what are the next steps? Like, I'm talking about like meat and potatoes. Do people go and download the app now? And then once the SAEF has this properly up and running, I assume there's a registration code that we use?
So basically, I think that you guys are set up. I'm just double checking right now while I'm talking to you. But basically, you would go onto the anonymous. You would go into the Play Store or the App Store, depending on obviously which system your phone is on. And then when you go into it, it'll ask you for the category. You'll choose sports, and then let me just see here. No, let's see if we put in there's so many federations on here. Okay,
well, that's a good sign. It's good to see everyone getting compliant and on board. I really like that.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't know that the anonymous reporting app is available yet, but just to kind of give it a bit of context. So basically, they would download the anonymous reporting app. I don't know if you can see my phone. Not really. Okay, so the little G that you can see at the top in that Guardian word, that's what the icon loaded. It's going to take you through a registration process. It, for example, will ask you your phone number so it can send you a one-time PIN. You then put in your details. It'll ask you what category. So are you choosing churches, schools, sports, and basically then you're up and loaded. You're ready to rock and roll. And then it gives you you then need to, every time you use it, you log in. When you log in, you can send an anonymous report. That anonymous report would go to the national DSO once that person is, and you can attach evidence to your report. Evidence may be a picture, it may be a video, it may be a voice note, maybe a document, whatever the case may be. That information will then go to the national DSO, who will then kind of work through the report. They they have the ability to come back to you. If you posted, I'm being bullied, they'd be able to come back to you and go, okay, I don't know who you are, because it's anonymous, but I can't help you because all you're telling me is you're being bullied. So can you tell me who is bullying you, or when you're being bullied, or where you're being bullied, or that communication, so that the person investigating can get as much information as possible, and so that they can put the right mechanism in place to prevent it going forward. It then also has a push notification feature, so we can kind of push information through the app to a feature. So if, God forbid, you were in a change room, something went wrong, the coach walks into the change room while you're changing, you're feeling uncomfortable, or whatever the case may be, you can push the panic button on the app. And when you push the panic button on the app, what it does is that web page is instantly SMSed to 3 predefined persons. So it could be mom, dad, and I don't know, whoever. I mean, 3 predefined
That's
persons receive that SMS. When you click on the URL to open up the page, so for example, when you open up the web page, every 10 seconds, every 10 seconds, 2 photos from the back and front camera of the phone are uploaded to the website. Every 10 seconds, the last 10 seconds of audio of the phone is uploaded to the website.
Mark,
and that
this
consistently
is really
keeps coming up. So you can.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
That's wonderful.
And what's awesome about it is that, God forbid, what you're going through is something that all of that evidence is available to be used either in a disciplinary inquiry or to be used in a criminal matter down the line. It can be used as evidence in court. So you can know exactly what happened. Plus, even for a university in Pretoria, if he hits the panic button, I can just forward that SMS to first responders who are on their way to him, and they can access that web page with all that information, so that when they get to him, they know where he is and how to help him. Overseas, So if you're touring, it really is an effective tool, and it's one of the tools. We've got so many. There's the safeguard software, which is going to roll out right throughout SAEF. There's so many other tools. No.
That's great. Mark, is there anything else that you would like to add before we dial off? We've really packed quite a lot into the last hour, and thank you so much for that. I would like to add to everybody that is listening that we will be speaking to a psychologist within the next few weeks, also discussing about the effects of bullying and what to do if this is happening in your safe space. But I would just like to remind everyone the link to the South African Equestrian Federation. It's been a very long day. To their safeguarding policies is in the blurb of the podcast. Mark, is there anything else that you would like to add? We're very excited for this to roll out.
I just think that you guys, you've got to embrace it. This is your federation. This is your sport. We often sit in a situation where we talk to the national office and the directors and the CEO and the MD and the presidents of the federation, and then it all kind of gets stuck when it gets to grassroots level, and we can't allow that to happen. This is not about the people at Exco making the call. This is about each individual making the call for your club, the athletes at your club being watching over. Their safeguarding is dependent on how much heart and how much drive you give this in your environment.
It's funny, Mark. We actually had an incident a little while ago where there was some on one of the social media platforms. there were some anonymous, not complaints, there were some anonymous confessions being made. And it was interesting that one of the first reactions was to chalk it up to salacious gossip. No one was named, and to shut it down. And I think it's really interesting that, as you say, we need to have a little bit of education around this throughout the SAEF. But I'm going to be really interested to see how this tool works effectively in the hands of the people who need it most. And I think to really give a voice to victims, hopefully.
Are you one of the DSOs that?
Sorry, Mark, I lost you there for a second.
I said, are you one of the people that's going to be doing the DSO course when it rolls out?
So I'm a coach, so I would be doing the safeguarding course, which is, as I said earlier on, it's going to become a mandatory certificate that coaches obviously have to hold, and I think that's great. And again, I think I really also do want to see. I've been an outspoken, I don't want to say critic of our national federation. So big ups to them for having me here to speak to you. But I think I'm always very vocal about things that can go wrong. And it's interesting to see something going right. And one of the things that's going right here is by having everything more legislated. I think it does create a much safer space. And for the cost of what registration is annually with your national federation, to get the benefits of an app like this and to have access to, I think we outlined them as SGOs, safeguarding officers. And I mean, the functionality of the app, I really do think it's worth it, especially for parents.
Good. Yeah, it is. You can't put a price on it.
Great. Mark, thank you for joining us tonight. That is
You're very
Mark,
welcome.
who is the managing director of theguardian.co.za. If you're interested in finding out more about the app or downloading it, please go ahead and have a look at that link. This is a reminder as well. The link is posted in the blurb under the podcast to the SAEF's safeguarding policies. And this is another final thank you to Lara Elwood. She has sponsored 10 counseling sessions for anyone who may need it. If you have experienced sexual harassment, assault, bullying, and intimidation, please reach out to her. She is, and this is another great thing, she is actually the resident counselor and mental health coach at Farnham Equestrian Centre and Riding School. And I really hope to see more riding schools following suit with something like this. I think it's a great initiative to have someone on site to speak to the kids. Lara's phone number, which I do have permission to share, is, trying to find it quickly here. It is sorry. And now, of course, everything's just opened up and gone all over the place. It is 072-076-149-5830. Thanks again to Lara Elwood for that. I think that's really putting your money where your mouth is. And if anyone is interested in becoming an SGO or a DSO, as Mark called them, please reach out to the South African Equestrian Federation Secretary General. That's Charlene. Her email address is saefsg@saef.org.za. And I would like to thank everyone for listening in tonight. I know that this was a very sensitive subject. We had some really poignant comments in the section. I hope everyone who needs to reaches out to Lara, but also does take heed of everything that Mark has said tonight and makes use of the Guardian app in the coming months and is familiar with the safeguarding policies. And as the Guardian said, to preserve the integrity of not only the sport, but of the athletes. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us here tonight. Stay safe. And if you hear something, if you see something, say something. Good night.